What if the real battle for global power isn't happening in Washington or Beijing, but right now, just south of the US border? For decades, the Western Hemisphere was considered America's uncontested sphere of influence. But that unspoken rule may have just been shattered. With a jaw-dropping $10 billion investment, China has quietly and decisively planted its flag in Mexico. Not through soldiers or diplomats, but with cranes, concrete, and capital. This is not just trade. This is a calculated move in a much larger geopolitical game, and it's being executed with the subtle precision of a grandmaster. The world is watching, but many don't yet understand what's unfolding. This isn't a random economic deal, it's a high-stakes chapter in the BRICS strategy to redraw the global order. It's a message to Washington. The age of uncontested dominance is over. Why is China choosing Mexico now? Why invest billions into a nation so deeply tied to the US? Economy and military partnerships? And why is this move being described by some analysts as the most daring shift in Latin American geopolitics in over 50 years? Because proximity is power. By anchoring itself in Mexico, China is no longer just a Pacific partner. It's now a neighbor, a player in the American neighborhood. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. Beijing is no longer content with the sidelines. It's coming straight into the ring, and it's doing it with the full weight of the BRICS alliance behind it. This $10 billion isn't just money, it's a message. It speaks of a world tilting, of a rebalancing, of a global south that is no longer waiting for invitations to power tables. It's building its own. The Trans-Isthmus Corridor in southern Mexico, linking the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, has suddenly become more than just a trade route. It's now a strategic artery in China's new economic diplomacy. Ports, railways, industrial parks, all infused with Chinese technology, funding, and long-term contracts. Quietly, efficiently, China is turning Mexico into a geopolitical bridge, one that connects not only oceans, but ideologies, economies, and emerging blocs. At the center of this, BRICS. Once dismissed as a loose coalition of developing nations, BRICS is now evolving into something far more formidable. With China at its helm and new alliances forming with countries like Mexico, the bloc is expanding its influence from Africa to Latin America, constructing an alternative narrative to the Western world order. And yet, despite the scale of this shift, much of the media remains silent. There are no front-page headlines, no breaking news banners. It's a silent revolution, unfolding through infrastructure and investment rather than weapons and warnings. But silence doesn't mean insignificance. This moment is historic. It may redefine the 21st century in ways we're only beginning to understand. Because when a superpower like China makes a move this bold, this close to American soil, it forces a reckoning, not just with foreign policy, but with the very idea of who leads the world and how that leadership is claimed. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Mexico isn't just a passive participant in this story. It's a strategic actor, navigating between its deep ties with the US and its growing economic seduction by the East. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador isn't playing checkers. He's playing chess on two boards at once. So while headlines are still dominated by wars, elections, and tech dramas, something much bigger is brewing, quietly, steadily, across the railways of Oaxaca and the ports of Coatzacoalcos. And now, the question isn't just why China is investing in Mexico. China crosses the line. $10 billion investment in Mexico. It wasn't announced with fireworks. There were no sweeping speeches or dramatic television broadcasts. And yet, in geopolitical terms, China's $10 billion investment in Mexico is nothing short of an earthquake. Quiet, deliberate, and strategic, this move marks a major turning point in the global balance of power. It's not just about money, it's about position, influence, territory, and above all, timing. The decision to inject such a colossal sum into southern Mexico is more than a business strategy. It's a territorial signal, a statement of presence. For decades, the Western Hemisphere was considered a US-dominated region, particularly Latin America. From trade agreements like NAFTA to security alliances and political pressure, the United States held firm control over what happened south of its border. But now, Beijing is changing the equation, not through confrontation, but construction. The Chinese government, in coordination with state-backed corporations, is building infrastructure hubs, ports, highways, energy plants, and special economic zones in southern Mexican states like Oaxaca and Veracruz. These aren't small projects, they're megastructures tied to a vision that stretches far beyond regional growth. Through this network of projects, China is embedding itself not just economically, but physically, layering its influence deep into Mexican soil at a distance that makes the US government more than just uncomfortable. And here's what most people don't realize. This isn't an isolated event. It's part of a broader strategy that has been unfolding slowly for years. China's Belt and Road Initiative has already linked ports in Africa, railways in Europe, and infrastructure in Southeast Asia. What we're witnessing now is the Western Hemisphere extension of that same model. It's bold and it's brilliant, because while global attention is distracted by conflicts in Europe and political shifts in Asia, Beijing is quietly executing one of the most daring maneuvers in modern history, placing economic and strategic routes less than 2,000 kilometers from Texas. But why Mexico? Why now? Mexico is a country in transformation. With the Trans-Isthmus Corridor project connecting the Pacific and Atlantic through a modern trade route in the south, the country is positioning itself as a logistics hub of the Americas. For China, this is golden. By investing in infrastructure tied to this corridor, it gains access to both oceans, bypassing Panama and potentially controlling key trade flows. It also allows Chinese products to be assembled in Mexico and then exported to the US. Under existing trade agreements, avoiding tariffs and restrictions, it's legal, effective, and impossible to ignore. But it's not just about trade, it's about symbolism. China is not sneaking in, it's stepping in, openly, unapologetically. This is a redrawing of invisible lines that have defined global spheres of influence for over a century. And the fact that it's happening through economic means makes it harder for Washington to push back without seeming hypocritical. After all, it's just business, right? Except it's never just business. China's investment sends a message to the global south. You don't need to look north for development. There are alternatives. There is BRICS. There is Beijing. This ideological shift, subtle but profound, is beginning to spread. Latin American countries once trapped between IMF loans and US diplomacy are starting to see new options, and China is offering them fast, flexible, and without the usual political strings. This is how modern empires grow. Not through war, but through wires, steel, and agreements. And it's happening right now at the very edge of the US perimeter. So here's the real question. Do you think China's move into Mexico is a smart strategic move or a dangerous provocation? Let me know what you think in the comments. Should the US be worried about this? Or is this the new normal in a multipolar world? Drop your take below. And if you made it this far, comment the phrase China's silent power, so I know you're part of the core audience. BRICS, expanding its footprint in Latin America. What we're witnessing is not an isolated play by China. It's the unfolding of a larger, more coordinated expansion of the BRICS alliance into Latin America. And it's moving with quiet intensity. This isn't just China acting on its own economic interests. It's part of a broader geopolitical shift where emerging powers are no longer content with regional influence. They're looking to reshape global dynamics. With Brazil already a founding BRICS member and Argentina knocking at the door, Mexico's deepening ties with China mark a pivotal moment in this strategy. It's not about joining BRICS officially yet. It's about aligning economically, ideologically, and strategically with a movement that's challenging the Western-led system at its core. The West has always positioned Latin America as a peripheral player in global affairs, a region to be managed, not empowered. But BRICS is flipping that narrative. It sees Latin America not as the backyard of the United States, but as fertile ground for economic collaboration, raw material extraction, infrastructure development, and, perhaps most critically, diplomatic realignment. China's investment in Mexico is a signal to the entire region. There's a new partner on the table, one that doesn't lecture about democracy, doesn't impose conditions, and doesn't expect allegiance to NATO or Washington. Instead, it offers capital, construction, and access to the fastest-growing markets in the world. This is where the subtle genius of BRICS comes into play. Rather than confronting the West directly, the bloc is building influence in places where American attention is fragmented. While the US is fixated on Eastern Europe, Taiwan, and internal polarization, BRICS is making moves in regions that used to be considered too close to US interests for comfort. Africa is one. Latin America is the next. And the strategy is elegant in its simplicity. Use economic partnerships to create political opportunities. Gain allies not through coercion, but through collaboration. Slowly, methodically, and without noise. Mexico is now at the center of this chessboard. Even though it hasn't applied for BRICS membership, the economic ties it's building with China make it a functional satellite in the bloc's orbit. And this goes far beyond infrastructure. Chinese banks are offering credit lines to Mexican firms. Chinese firms are offering technology solutions for logistics, energy, and security. And with each new agreement, the ground shifts a little further beneath Washington's feet. Some might argue that Mexico is simply diversifying its economic relationships, that it's pragmatic, not political. But in geopolitics, perception is power. And the perception right now, especially among Latin American elites, is that BRICS is not just an acronym. It's an invitation to a different future. A future less dependent on the IMF, less tied to the dollar, and less dominated by the traditional rules of Western finance. A multipolar world is not coming, it's already here, and Mexico may be the latest staging ground for its rise. There's also the cultural dimension to this expansion. China has been quietly investing in Spanish-language media, funding academic partnerships, and even offering scholarships for Latin American students to study in Chinese universities. These may seem like soft gestures, but they're part of a long game. Influence isn't built overnight, it's nurtured. And BRICS, with its slower, steadier rhythm, is proving it can play that game better than many expected. Right now, many viewers might still be asking, is this really about BRICS or just about business? But those who've been watching the geopolitical board know the truth. Every bridge built, every port funded, every handshake between a Latin leader and a Chinese delegate, these are moves on a deeper level. BRICS is no longer trying to catch up with the West. It's carving its own path. And if Mexico continues walking down that path, the balance of power in the Americas may be shifting before our very eyes. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Mexico should move closer to the BRICS alliance? Or is this alignment too risky for a country so tied to the US? If you're deep in this video, drop the phrase "the new game board" in the comments so I know you're watching this unfold with full awareness. Nearshoring or power shift? What China's really doing? At first glance, China's deepening presence in Mexico could be explained through a simple, non-threatening term: nearshoring. It's the corporate buzzword of the decade. Companies moving production closer to major consumer markets, reducing shipping times, bypassing bottlenecks, and protecting themselves from supply chain shocks. In a post-pandemic economy, it sounds logical, even harmless. But dig deeper, and the picture changes. What's happening in Mexico isn't just nearshoring, it's strategic positioning. It's an assertion of influence disguised as efficiency, and the quiet genius of China's play is that it uses the language of business to mask the architecture of power. For decades, China built its industrial empire on being the world's factory, but rising wages, energy costs, and geopolitical tensions are pushing Beijing to rethink its production lines. Enter Mexico, perfectly positioned, economically flexible, and geographically invaluable. With direct land access to the US market, existing trade frameworks like USMCA, and a growing labor force hungry for investment, Mexico provides a golden gateway. But China isn't merely outsourcing assembly lines. It's embedding its entire production ecosystem, suppliers, logistics hubs, R&D centers, and even financing arms into the Mexican landscape. This isn't about cost-cutting. It's about creating permanence. Factories in the state of Nuevo León, ports in Veracruz, and corridors across Oaxaca are now part of a quietly growing web of Chinese-backed development. Unlike Western corporations, which often lease facilities and rely on third parties, Chinese firms are buying land, securing long-term agreements, and bringing in their own technicians and managerial staff. These are not just investments, they're footholds. And every new facility built is one more piece in a larger network that shifts regional dependencies away from Washington and closer to Beijing's orbit. What makes this even more intriguing is how it interacts with US expectations. Washington encouraged nearshoring as a strategy to reduce reliance on China. The idea was to pull companies out of Asia and bring them closer to home, to friendlier, more secure environments. But the unintended twist? China flipped that narrative. Instead of losing its production dominance, it simply relocated parts of its operations to where the trade benefits are most favorable, right next door to the US. Now, products labeled "Made in Mexico" may in fact be part of a China-driven supply chain. American consumers may feel safer buying from a NAFTA neighbor, all while unknowingly supporting the very country they were trying to decouple from. This misdirection is subtle but powerful. It reveals how China is not playing the old geopolitical game. It's rewriting the rules. While Washington debates troop movements and sanctions, Beijing builds ports and railways. While the US pushes rhetoric about democracy and security, China signs silent deals and opens factories, and it's working. Latin America, once a reliable sphere of Western influence, is slowly becoming a chessboard of quiet realignment, and Mexico is one of the most strategic squares on that board. And let's not overlook the Mexican response. Officials in Mexico City and in local governments aren't blind to the magnitude of what's happening. For them, this is opportunity. Chinese investment is breathing life into long-neglected regions, building jobs, infrastructure, and in some cases even political capital. In areas where federal support has historically been minimal, Chinese-led development is being welcomed not with suspicion, but with applause. In communities across southern Mexico, a new narrative is taking root, that prosperity doesn't have to come from the north, that maybe the road to development now runs east. There's also the question of long-term integration. China isn't operating with short-term ROI models in Mexico. These are generational plans. Once infrastructure is built, once logistics corridors are connected, once supply chains are in place, the dependency is locked in. And unlike Western investment, which often pulls out when profit margins shrink or political climates shift, China is playing for endurance. Once it's in, it stays. It adapts. It embeds itself so thoroughly into the economic bloodstream that removing it would feel like cutting out an organ. This approach is reshaping more than trade, it's subtly reshaping allegiance. Countries that rely on Chinese infrastructure eventually begin to adopt more China-friendly stances in international forums. They support China in UN votes. They align with BRICS economic policies. They speak the language of multipolarity, not because of ideology, but because of interdependence. And while that shift may seem slow, it's steady. Every warehouse, every highway, every data center built by Chinese companies in Mexico is a brick in that new global architecture. So the real question isn't whether this is nearshoring or not. The real question is, are we watching the foundations of a new global power structure being poured right under America's nose? The US reaction: silent alarm bells. While much of the public discussion remains muted, behind closed doors in Washington, alarm bells are quietly ringing. The presence of China in Mexico, America's immediate neighbor and second largest trading partner, is not being taken lightly by US intelligence agencies, defense strategists, and economic advisors. What appears on the surface to be just another chapter in global trade is, to those monitoring strategic threats, a potential Trojan horse. The proximity of this $10 billion Chinese investment to the US mainland is viewed by many in national security circles as more than a business decision. It's a geopolitical signal that the traditional borders of influence are being tested. The United States has long relied on the Monroe Doctrine as an informal shield to keep foreign powers out of the Western Hemisphere, particularly adversarial one. And while the world has changed dramatically since that doctrine was first articulated in 1823, the psychological and strategic instinct behind it remains very real. Latin America, and especially Mexico, has always been considered within the US sphere of influence. But with China now building infrastructure, financing logistics, and embedding production pipelines just across the border, the nature of this influence is being openly challenged, not through military means, but through something arguably more difficult to counter: long-term economic presence. In recent months, congressional hearings have quietly included sessions dedicated to reviewing Chinese economic activity in North America. Reports from US embassies in Mexico have become more frequent and detailed. Defense analysts are mapping the potential dual-use nature of Chinese-built ports and industrial facilities. What if a logistics hub today becomes a surveillance post tomorrow? What if financial dependency leads to political leverage? These are not conspiracy theories, they're real questions being debated in policy think tanks and security briefings. The concern is not just what China is doing now, but what it will be able to do in 5, 10, or 20 years if this trajectory continues unchecked. And yet, the US response remains largely restrained. There have been no major public statements, no sweeping countermeasures. Why? Because Washington finds itself in a delicate position. To confront China's investment in Mexico too aggressively risks appearing imperialistic or hypocritical, especially when the same type of investments have been lauded in other regions. On the other hand, ignoring it may allow the situation to evolve beyond control. It's a strategic conundrum. How do you push back against influence that doesn't arrive with tanks or troops, but with contracts and cranes? Moreover, there's the domestic economic layer to consider. Many American companies benefit from the same nearshoring wave that China is riding. US firms are also moving operations to Mexico, using it as a production base to reduce reliance on Asia. So any effort to scrutinize China's activities could inadvertently impact American corporations operating under the same logistical model. The entanglement is complex. It's not black and white, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. This tension is reflected in the growing number of private diplomatic engagements between the US and Mexican officials. While publicly cordial, many of these conversations now carry undertones of strategic concern. Washington wants assurances that Mexico will not allow Chinese influence to undermine its security commitments or trade priorities with the US. At the same time, Mexico asserts its right to diversify its partnerships and attract foreign investment. It's a tightrope, and the wind is picking up. Meanwhile, China continues to advance with calm precision. No aggression, no provocation, just progress, on its own terms. The silent nature of its expansion makes it difficult for the US to mobilize public support against it. There are no tanks crossing borders, no overt alliances being declared, but the outcome may be just as consequential. Because by the time the threat is visible to the average citizen, it may already be too deeply rooted to reverse. López Obrador's calculated gamble. In the middle of this growing geopolitical storm stands Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a leader known for his nationalist tone and deep-rooted desire to reclaim economic independence for his country. His administration has repeatedly emphasized a Mexico-first vision, focused on sovereignty, regional development, and breaking free from what he often describes as the historic economic subordination to the United States. And it is within this context that his engagement with China begins to take on a much deeper, more strategic meaning. Because make no mistake, López Obrador knows exactly what he's doing. This isn't passivity, it's calculation. He's playing a high-stakes game of balance, using global tension as leverage for national transformation. For decades, Mexico's industrial growth has been concentrated in the north, closely tied to the American border and reliant on U.S. consumption. The South, by contrast, has remained largely underdeveloped, plagued by poverty, weak infrastructure, and minimal investment. AMLO's ambitious plan to shift this imbalance is rooted in mega-projects like the Trans-Isthmus Corridor and the Tren Maya. These aren't just transportation links, they're part of a vision to create a new economic axis that runs across the southern states, turning them into hubs of productivity and logistical relevance. But such a transformation demands something Mexico historically lacked in these regions: massive capital infusion. This is where China enters the scene, not just as a financier, but as a willing partner in reshaping the map of Mexican prosperity. From AMLO's perspective, accepting Chinese investment isn't necessarily a betrayal of U.S. interests. It's a declaration of independence. He's telling the world that Mexico will no longer rely on a single partner, nor will it ask for permission to pursue opportunity. China brings more than money. It brings speed, engineering capacity, and a political posture that doesn't interfere with internal governance. For a government focused on quick results and long-term legacy, that's irresistible. But this partnership also comes with hidden layers of risk, ones López Obrador is fully aware of and appears ready to navigate. What's often misunderstood is that AMLO is not throwing himself into Beijing's arms. He's leveraging the fear of U.S. decline and the rise of China to extract better terms from both. It's a classic hedging strategy used by leaders of middle powers who understand the art of playing giants against each other without becoming a pawn. By opening the door to Chinese investments, he's forcing the U.S. to pay attention. He's signaling that if Washington continues to overlook southern Mexico, someone else will step in. And in doing so, he's pushing the U.S. into re-evaluating its role, not as Mexico's benefactor, but as its partner. Still, this strategy is not without its critics. Some within AMLO's own political circle fear the long-term implications of tying vital infrastructure to Chinese funding. There are concerns over debt traps, sovereignty, and the potential erosion of local industries. But AMLO, known for his firm grip over national narratives, has thus far maintained control of the public message. In his speeches, the emphasis remains on jobs, on development, on justice for the South, and that resonates deeply with a population that has waited for decades to be seen. The question now is whether this gamble will pay off. Will López Obrador succeed in pulling Mexico into a more balanced global position? Or will the attempt to walk between giants end in unintended consequences? The answer depends not just on Chinese intentions or American reactions, but on how Mexico itself manages the internal transformation now set in motion. The industrial zones, Trojan horses, or growth engines? The industrial zones now emerging in southern Mexico are being hailed by some as engines of national development and by others as potential Trojan horses, silent but powerful tools for foreign influence. What makes this debate so compelling is not just the scale of the investment, but the speed and nature with which it is taking shape. These zones are not your average business parks. They're being built with extraordinary precision, equipped with state-of-the-art logistics systems, specialized trade corridors, integrated customs platforms, and even digital surveillance infrastructure. And at the core of much of this activity are Chinese firms, state-backed giants with deep capital reserves and global ambitions. They're not just participants, they are leading the design. In these zones, especially those tied to the Trans-Isthmus corridor, China's footprint is both physical and strategic. Factories aren't simply assembling consumer goods. They are part of vertically integrated chains that stretch from raw material extraction in South America to component production in Asia to final assembly in Mexico and distribution across North America. This is the quiet globalization of manufacturing, but this time through a BRICS lens. With Chinese investment comes Chinese standards, and often Chinese personnel, engineers, logistics experts, managers. They're not just bringing technology, they're bringing culture, systems, and long-term dependencies that embed themselves into the local economy in ways few realize at first glance. Local communities, meanwhile, are caught in the middle of this transformation. For many, the arrival of these industrial parks means jobs, better roads, new schools, and access to infrastructure that was never prioritized by previous administrations. In towns that have struggled for decades with poverty and lack of opportunity, this development feels like progress, fast, visible, and finally tangible. The economic optimism is real. Construction booms are already being felt in areas previously written off by investors. Municipalities are offering tax incentives, easing land permits, and competing for attention from international contractors. The vibe on the ground is not one of foreign intrusion, but of long overdue awakening. And yet, beneath this optimism lies a deeper question: who's really in control? When a foreign company finances, builds, and operates critical logistics corridors, what level of influence does it truly gain over national policy? When the hardware that powers these parks, data centers, surveillance cameras, communications infrastructure, is provided by foreign tech firms, what happens to digital sovereignty? These concerns are no longer hypothetical. We've seen similar patterns in Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, where infrastructure projects that began as development miracles gradually morphed into leverage points for political and economic pressure. In some cases, debts were restructured under opaque terms. In others, governments found themselves diplomatically constrained by the fear of offending a partner who had quietly become a benefactor. This is why some analysts warn that these industrial zones could evolve into platforms of soft power, where influence isn't forced, but assumed. China doesn't need to dictate terms directly when its companies are deeply woven into the functioning of supply chains, job markets, and even local governance. It's a form of modern empire building, not through colonies, but contracts. And the most effective part, it doesn't look like conquest. It looks like cooperation. That's why the metaphor of the Trojan horse resonates so powerfully. Everything appears to be in service of growth, until one day you realize the keys to your most strategic assets are no longer entirely in your hands. Still, from a purely economic perspective, these zones are producing results. Mexico's GDP in the southern states is already showing signs of acceleration. Regional export numbers are climbing, real estate values are rising, and international attention, especially from Asian and European investors, is beginning to shift toward these newly connected corridors. The momentum is undeniable. What remains to be seen is whether this momentum can be channeled into a development model that maintains true sovereignty, or whether it becomes an entry point for long-term dependency masked as growth. The decisions being made now about who builds, who operates, and who profits will shape Mexico's geopolitical positioning for decades. These zones could elevate the country to a new level of relevance in the global economy. or they could subtly erode its ability to make independent decisions when it matters most. The infrastructure is rising fast. The narrative is still being written, and the line between opportunity and overreach has never been thinner. So let me hear your take. Are these zones symbols of progress or silent instruments of control? If you followed this story this far, drop the phrase "behind the concrete" in the comments so I know you're truly paying attention to what's happening beyond the headlines. What this means for the global order. What we are watching unfold in Mexico is far bigger than an isolated investment strategy or a regional infrastructure project. It is, in many ways, a glimpse into the future architecture of global power, one that no longer revolves exclusively around Washington, Brussels, or the old institutions of the 20th century. The expansion of China's influence through strategic investments, particularly under the banner of BRICS cooperation, signals the emergence of a new global order, an order where alliances are built not through military pacts, but through ports, supply chains, and transnational development corridors. Mexico, sitting at the crossroads of North and South, West and East, is becoming one of the earliest laboratories of this transformation. This isn't just about BRICS adding another informal partner to its orbit. It's about redefining the rules of global engagement. For the past 70 years, the dominant model of development has been largely dictated by Western financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. These institutions offered capital, but often with strings attached, pushing neoliberal policies, austerity programs, and political alignments that aligned with US interests. What China is now offering, both individually and through the momentum of BRICS, is a fundamentally different approach: investment without interference, development without conditionality, and partnership without ideological pressure. That pitch is resonating in the global South, and now, for the first time, it's being tested right next to the US border. By embedding itself economically in Mexico, China is effectively saying, geography no longer limits influence. You don't have to invade a country to shape it. You don't have to coerce a government to realign its interests. All you need is to build where others hesitate, to invest where others impose, and to show up consistently where others arrive late. This model, patient, methodical, and dressed in the language of development, has already worked in Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. Now it's being deployed in Latin America with unprecedented precision. And the stakes, both symbolic and strategic, couldn't be higher. As this unfolds, the traditional centers of Western power are being forced to confront a reality they didn't fully prepare for. A world where influence is no longer monopolized, where countries can move between spheres of partnership, choosing what suits them rather than being told what's allowed. Where infrastructure is just as much a tool of diplomacy as embassies or treaties. In this world, soft power is coded into supply routes. Influence is embedded into fiber optic cables. And global alignment begins with who builds your roads and powers your factories, not who delivers speeches at your parliament. Mexico's trajectory, then, becomes a litmus test for the future of global multipolarity. If China's model proves successful, if Mexico reaps economic benefits, expands its regional influence, and maintains sovereignty without falling into dependence, it could set a powerful precedent for other middle powers navigating a rapidly shifting international landscape. Countries like Colombia, Peru, or even non-BRICS members like Indonesia and Vietnam will be watching closely. If Mexico thrives within this framework, it could mark the point where the global South begins to operate on its own terms, not as clients of the West, but as strategic actors in a distributed world order. And BRICS itself, often dismissed as a loose club of emerging economies, may find in Mexico a case study for what the next phase of its evolution looks like. The alliance has already expanded to include new players like Egypt and Ethiopia, and discussions around a common currency and integrated payment systems are heating up. The goal is no longer just to create an alternative to Western dominance. It's to create an entirely new framework, one where power flows through different pipelines, from Shanghai to São Paulo, from Johannesburg to Jakarta, from Beijing to Oaxaca. Yet, as we've seen throughout history, shifts in global power don't happen without friction. As BRICS grows bolder and countries like Mexico draw closer to its sphere, we can expect pressure, pushback, and attempts at containment from existing powers. Washington won't sit idly by while its closest neighbor becomes a gateway for competing influence. Economic countermeasures, trade recalibrations, and even digital warfare may become tools of resistance. But if China continues to move with the same quiet intensity, and if Mexico remains committed to leveraging this opportunity without losing control, the BRICS blueprint could become far more than a regional alternative. It could become the foundation of a truly multipolar world. If you've made it this far, we truly want to know, how did this video speak to your heart? Take a moment to comment below with the phrase, "I enjoyed the content," and share with us how this message resonated with you personally. Your voice matters here. This space is more than just information. It's a community of people seeking truth, insight, and transformation in a rapidly changing world. So don't hold back. Let us know your thoughts, your reflections, and what part of this content impacted you the most. And if this video brought clarity, perspective, or even challenged the way you see the world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another powerful piece of content. Hit that like button to support this mission of bringing truth to light. And of course, stay with us, because the next video is already on the end screen, ready for you to dive even deeper. May God bless your life abundantly. Stay strong, stay aware, and stay connected to the greater purpose behind everything that's unfolding.